Okay. Boy, we're going to talk about a lot. I'm actually going to, and this is going to shock you, I'm actually going to go through the PowerPoints. I know, it's a shock. I don't want you to get lost. This is the section, this is the unit that you guys will all understand, because it's all European type stuff. You guys all know about World War I, World War II. It's totally not new to you. Okay? But I'm still going to focus on the themes. So I'm going to cover the facts as storylines, but I'm not going to give you big details. So it's going to be this weird, I'm going to actually cover over the facts, but I'm not going to give you any of them. Not very many. Not as many, I mean, just like I normally do. But the thing is that you'll notice some of these things. You'll be familiar to you. So don't be tricked into thinking that I'm giving you the whole story. You still need to read. That's where the details will come out. The good news of a broad overview is you know where to pick up your stories. That makes sense? 1800s and 19th century is very confusing for people in Europe because you suddenly have, lots and lots of countries, and then suddenly you get new countries that pop up out of them. And so you're using names like Prussia, which nobody ever hears of, and then suddenly you have Germany, and it's not easy to understand the connection between these. So what I'm going to try to do is, last class, I talked about the empires kind of spinning out, and that the competition between these empires is what led to World War I. Well, I want you to understand this more specifically today. And if I'm going to be specific, what I want you to understand is Europe's trend in nationalism and diplomacy. And this is very much a Western Civ topic, so I'm just going to warn you, I'm not going to give you as many details, because what I really want you to get is what is being diffused. Do you understand what I'm saying by this? Remember, I went over all the units, and every unit we're talking about Europe going out and reaching out, right? Well, in this 20th century, it's World War I, World War II, and we're still kind of at the beginning of this unit. And the question is, what is being diffused by these examples? You're going to have Germany starting up and being a country. Well, in order to be a country, you've got to fight lots and lots of wars. Italy is going to rise up and be a country. It wasn't a country before. It was just a bunch of little city-states. So what did they do? What did the rest of the world kind of see from that? Second thing I want you to get, how is the United States different? Okay, and from this, what does it diffuse? So, if I can put this in a big picture, we've got 4 lectures here. We've got pre-World War I, which is I just talked about on Monday. We're going to have World War I this lecture. We're going to have World War II this lecture. And then we're going to talk about the Cold War, but mainly in terms of decolonization, because for world history, we're much more concerned about how this is affecting the world. But you should know, if you don't know already, the Cold War is fought in the previously colonized regions. The Cold War is fought in the Third World. Why is that? You don't have to know any knowledge, but you can take a wild guess. Why do the main powers of the Cold War, which would be the West, which would be the U.S. and the Allies, England, France, and the Soviet Union and China, these are the 2 main powers, why do they choose to fight in Third World countries?
Don't mess up them.
I mean, that's it, right? Because what happens if they fight directly?
There's going to be more damage.
It's World War III. If you have World War III, can you not use the biggest weapons in your arsenal? If you are actually being threatened and you might lose, can you keep these weapons in reserve and say we're not going to use them? And what are our biggest weapons? Nuclear weapons. So if we have main powers fighting after World War II, if we have main powers fighting directly, can we avoid nuclear war? No. So you have to have indirect fighting. That's why it's called a Cold War instead of a war. You guys don't know this, it's not part of your history, but when I was in high school, the Cold War was still going on. It doesn't end until 1991, right? And so when I was in high school in the late 80s, we would talk about this all the time. And it's hard for you to imagine this, but when I was in high school, my friends, they never thought it would end. They thought it was a permanent condition. The United States and the Soviet Union would always be on the brink of nuclear war. They had movies about, the end of nuclear war.
Well, you grew up in Alaska, right?
I did.
Being that close to Russia, does that have anything to do with it too? Or?
No. Although it's funny because I don't know if you know anything about Anchorage, but we're on this bowl, and right behind us are these mountains that go up a mile. So it's beautiful to see all these mountains. Well, up in those mountains are little missile silos. Right there, and they go, shh, that's where and not all of them are there, but that's where some of the silos are, right? So we knew that, but we were also not going to be hurt. It wasn't the closeness or the proximity, it was a national issue. I know you guys ever saw Red Dawn? Okay, they had a remake of it, kind of totally out of place now, but then Red Dawn was about Soviet Union, right? And you had the day after, which was about what happens the day after nuclear war. I mean, this fear of nuclear war was there. So in high school, I remember people saying, we'll never end this. And the irony of ironies is by the time I was a junior in high school, it's done. But if you imagine, the war starts, Cold War starts in 1947, and by 1980s, it's been 40 years, and so they thought that it would never end. And yet it ended really quick. My point here is that these two questions, if you look at the big picture, what we are looking at is predominantly Europe dominating the world. And in World War I, which is over empires, it's still mostly Europe. But at this time, the U.S. is a really big power. In World War II, who is becoming a major leader?
The U.S.
The U.S. Now, it doesn't dominate right before the war. Before the war, the U.S. is really on the sidelines. But once we get into the war, then things change. And so, it's U.S. is rising, and who's really dominating in the Cold War? The U.S., and who's on the other side? Now, clearly France and England and people are on our side, but who's on the other side? Soviet Union, right? USSR. Those are the two main forces. So then we look at these questions. What was Europe diffusing in this era? What was Europe peddling? That make sense? And what did the United States introduce? And hopefully just by looking at the questions, you know they're not the same thing. Does that make sense? The U.S. begins to start peddling this here, not very successful, but it becomes successful in World War II, and it becomes the dominant thing today. And you know this, the concept of human rights, where does this come from?
John Locke.
It does. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. And I don't care where you go, people can understand the concept of human rights, right? And it's what defines the existence of our country. And yet, it was not a concept that was big in World War I. It becomes a concept in World War II. And it's not just because the United States is super powerful and great, we're going to shove it down everybody's throat. Why would human rights become most important? Again, this is the whole story. We haven't told it yet, but you guys know enough about general history to kind of guess this. Why would human rights become such a big issue during and after, especially after World War II?
The Holocaust.
Of course. Absolutely. Hitler is like the epitome of anti-human rights. And not just Hitler, Stalin, right? Mao Zedong. So the Cold War, if it's anything, is really a contest between the rule of law and the rule of might. And guess which side is which? So what we're talking about today is I want to go over World War I, and what I'm really doing, and I'm going to give you lots of stories and details, but don't get weighed down by this. The bigger story is just talking about what Europe is bringing to the table up to World War I, and the fact that the United States doesn't participate. When the war starts, we are very explicit. We are not going to participate. Now, did we end up participating?
Yeah.
Yeah, we did. But why? You don't know this. You guys had USS. You should remember it. Maybe you don't. You don't have to know this. Why is it that we participate?
Sinking the Lusitania.
No, that's a good start. That happens in 1915. It causes us to be upset. It's what? That's part of it. It's unrestricted submarine warfare. The Lusitania causes the United States to say, you cannot do that. You cannot be sinking ships without identifying it. It's against the rules of war. It's against the rules of war, right? And what's funny is that Germany says, okay, we won't. And for 2 years, they don't. And as a result, they follow the rules of war. As a result, they pop up and their submarines get sunk out of the blue. Lose thousands. And so after that, they get to a point of desperation when they say we're going to declare unrestricted submarine warfare, plus the Zimmerman telegram, but basically saying we're going to shoot everything we see. And the United States gets involved not because we have anything against Germany, not because we particularly like England, but because we believe that we need to protect the rights of neutrals to be able to live without being sucked into a war. And we are very powerful. We're the only country that can do it, so that's what we do it. And so when we enter in, we are introducing a new concept into the global arena. And at the time, we have an amazing amount of faith that this will work. The League of Nations. This is pre-United Nations. It's not the same. The League of Nations was our idea. It's an American idea. That we will have this Congress. It's basically like a Congress of all the countries. And if we have this Congress, we'll never have war again. Because people, when they have a problem, they'll just take it to the League of Nations. We'll talk about it. We'll be reasonable. And we will never have war again. Now, you can understand why this is a hugely optimistic idea. But we, in 1915, 1920, were amazingly optimistic as a country. We call it progressivism, right? It dominated our country. We call it, historians refer to that as the progressive era. My kind of, you could call it my interpretation of history is from that era, progressivism. Not exactly the same, but kind of. Progressivism is the idea that we progress over time. That the future is better than the past. Most of you kind of think that way in terms of technology, but don't really think of it in terms of other things. We're a remarkably cynical lot nowadays. But not in 1920. They had amazing confidence that we could fix this. Now, obviously, it didn't work. There's lots of reasons why it didn't work, and I'll talk about these in turn, but I'll just give you one example. In 1929, the United States, we came up with this idea of the League of Nations, but I'll explain, we don't actually end up joining the League of Nations. We get very disillusioned. I'll explain this when we get there. I'll just say that we felt betrayed, and so we were worried that what England was bringing was still dominating, that their trends are what was dominating diplomacy. And so we were afraid that we didn't want to be part of it, so we didn't join the League of Nations. But that didn't mean that we were out. So this treaty called the Kellogg-Briand Pact in 1929. Kellogg-Briand. Kellogg was the Secretary of State in the United States. Briand was the Secretary of State in France. It was a a treaty between our two countries, but 160 countries ended up signing on to it. So it was like a big global treaty. And it said, unbelievably optimistically, war is illegal. You cannot use war to get your national agenda further. War is illegal. Why is that such an optimism? And the thing is, today, I don't know, today there's lots of, I don't want to say hippies, but okay. Lots of folks that say, yeah, let's outlaw war. What's wrong with this treaty? How can you enforce it? What do you have to do to enforce it? Yeah, if somebody attacks you and you say war is illegal, you guys are violating the law, what do you have to do in order to prosecute? In order to stop them? You have to fight them, right? So it's one of those laws that's just not possible. And yet it does reflect, oddly enough, even though the United States was worried that Europe's ideas were dominating, what's odd is that by the 1920s, America's ideas really do become more dominant. Even though we're not part of the League of Nations, and we really have very little to do with the rise of World War II. And again, when World War II starts, we don't jump in because we're afraid that it's really being dominated by these old ideas. But it's not the same as World War I. World War I, we really didn't like anybody. We didn't think England was good. We didn't think Germany was good. They're all bad. I don't mean like bad countries, but following an old style that's basically rule of might. World War II, clearly, one side was following rule of might. Hitler, Mussolini, Stalin, Japan. And one style was following rule of law. England, France, and eventually the United States. When the Cold War erupts, when World War II is over, Germany is no longer a power. Japan is no longer a power. Italy is no longer a threat. I mean, they're countries, but they're no longer military threats. And so you have a vacuum. And who fills in that monopoly of rule of might? Germany's not there anymore. Japan's not there anymore. Italy's not there anymore. Who's the only country left?
Russia.
Russia. So, and that's the whole story of the Cold War. The Cold War is this rule of might versus the rule of law. But by this time, it's not just the United States. It's England, it's France, it's the free world. And so then we see this story slowly begin. So today, what I really want to get, and I'll do it through some details, but I want you to see Europe's trends. And I'll just be frank. It's about rule of might. They're not doing it as viciously as, say, Napoleon did, right? Where he's literally trying to take over the rest of the world. But it's still the same concept. If you have enough force, if you have enough military, you can make sure people will do what you want them to do. The new idea, which is what the West is going to do, what the United States is doing, is rule by law. If you establish laws, this will work.